There was a map in the music box, and it led me to my mother. The music stopped at the exact moment I was blowing out my candles. 48 candles, 48 years of life, and my precious music box chose this day to die. I froze with the blown-out candles in my hands, listening to the silence. For 40 years, that little ballerina had spun to Brahms's lullaby. For 40 years, it had been my only connection to the woman who gave birth to me. And now it had fallen silent forever on my birthday. What cruel irony. My daughter Emily tried to comfort me, saying it was just a coincidence, but I knew better. Nothing happens by chance, especially when it involves the only thing you have left from your real mother. The music box had been with me since childhood. Mom and Dad Williams gave it to me when I turned 8. Before that, they were afraid I'd break it. Kids will be kids. I remember that day like it was yesterday. Mom sat next to me on the bed and carefully placed the music box on my lap. Mom explained that this was all they had from my first mother. She loved me very much, but couldn't keep me. She wanted me to grow up in a good family. The music box was antique, carved from dark wood with mother-of-pearl inlays. When I lifted the lid, a little porcelain ballerina in a blue dress would start spinning to a gentle melody. I'd sit for hours watching her, imagining my real mom. Was she beautiful? Who did I look like? Why did she give me away? The Williams were wonderful people, loving, patient, wise. They never hid the truth about my adoption from me, answered all my questions honestly, but they had little information about my biological mother. A young woman, difficult life circumstances, wanted the best for her child. A standard story for the 1920s. Now, at 48, I was a successful manager at an insurance company, mother of 2 grown children, a recently divorced woman rebuilding her life, and my only connection to my past had just been severed. The next morning, I took the music box to Henry Porter, owner of an antique repair shop on Main Street. Henry was one of those rare craftsmen who could fix anything, from Victorian clocks to 19th century music mechanisms. Henry examined the mechanism, turned the music box in his hands, listened to sounds inside. The mechanism had rusted, but it was fixable. He pointed out marks on the bottom, a craftsman's stamp. Such music boxes were made in the 20s and 30s. A real rarity. The repair would take a week, maybe 2. He needed to order parts, but promised to bring the music box back to life. I left the music box with Henry with a heavy heart. Home felt somehow empty without its melody. 10 days later, Henry called me at work, excitement in his voice. He asked me to come immediately. He'd found something amazing. I rushed to the shop, my heart pounding with anticipation. Henry met me at the door, his eyes bright with curiosity. Henry explained his discovery. When he was taking apart the mechanism, he noticed the bottom of the music box was too thick. Usually these models have thin bottoms. He tapped the walls and realized there was something inside. On his workbench lay my music box, disassembled. Next to it, a small wooden panel, obviously a false bottom. There was a secret compartment. Henry showed me his discovery. Henry handed me a small bundle wrapped in yellowed silk. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the fabric. Inside were 3 items: a folded paper, a tiny black and white photograph, and a thin gold chain with a heart-shaped locket. The photograph was the size of a postage stamp. It showed the face of a young woman, maybe 25 years old. Beautiful eyes, soft features, a sad smile. I peered at her face. looking for resemblance, but too many years had passed to be certain. The chain was delicate work, obviously expensive. On the back of the heart locket was engraved the letter R. But the most stunning thing was the contents of the paper. It was a handmade map, drawn in ink on thick paper. I recognized the outline of our region, the Willamette River, the Cascade Mountains, major roads. 2 places were marked on the map: a cross in the center of Salem with the note, "Here you live," and a red dot about 30 miles east with the note, "Here it all began, May 1927. In the corner of the map, in shaky handwriting, "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, find the place on the map. There lies the truth about why I couldn't keep you. Know that Mom loved you every day. R." I stood in Henry's shop and cried. For 40 years, I had carried a music box with a note from my mother on my desk and never knew it. Henry studied the map with me. The coordinates led somewhere in Marion County, in the Silverton area. I knew Silverton, a small town in the foothills surrounded by farms and forests. What could be there that connected to my birth? And why did the map say May 1927, a year before my official birthday? Henry agreed to determine the exact coordinates. He had detailed regional maps. While Henry worked with the maps, I sat looking at the photograph of the woman with the letter R on the chain. Rose? Rebecca? Ruth? Who are you, Mom? And what happened in that place in May 1927? After half an hour, Henry announced the result. The coordinates led to an old farm on Silver Creek Road, the McDonald farm. Though no one had lived there for about 15 years. McDonald. The name meant nothing to me, but somehow caused vague uneasiness. The next day, Saturday, I drove to Silverton. Silver Creek Road turned out to be a narrow gravel road leading through dense forest. I drove slowly, checking the map, until I saw a crooked wooden sign with barely readable writing. McDonald Farm. The road to the farm was overgrown with grass, but still passable. After half a mile, the forest opened up, revealing a view of an abandoned homestead. The main house stood on a hill, small, single-story, once yellow, now gray with time. The roof sagged, the porch leaned. Nearby was a half-ruined barn and an overgrown garden. I parked by the house and got out. The place looked long abandoned, but something about it was familiar, as if I'd seen it in a dream. The front door was locked, but a window on the porch opened. I carefully made my way inside. The house wasn't completely empty. In the living room stood old furniture covered in dust and stacks of yellowed papers on the table. Among the papers, I found letters addressed to Miss Agnes McDonald, dated in the 60s. Electric bills, tax notices, medical prescriptions. Someone named Agnes had lived here until recently. In an old sideboard, I discovered family photographs and, to my amazement, medical documents tied with ribbon. These were notes from some doctor dated in the late 20s. The handwriting was neat, professional. I began reading and went cold. An entry from April 15th, 1927. Patient R. Henderson, 28 years old. Pregnancy 8 months. Special circumstances. Birth planned at McDonald Farm in complete secrecy. Miss Agnes McDonald agreed to provide location and help as an experienced midwife. R. Henderson, Rose Henderson, my mother. The next entry was from May 3rd, 1927. Birth successful at 3:20 a.m. Girl, healthy, 3.2 kilograms. Mother fine, but requests immediate transfer of baby to adoptive parents. Agnes MacDonald was an excellent assistant. Documents processed with changed birth date. May 3rd, 1928, for complete confidentiality. Signed, Dr. W. Blake. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. May 3rd, 1927, exactly 1 year earlier than my official birthday. Dr. Blake had deliberately changed the year in the documents. I continued reading. The notes mentioned that the birth took place in strictest secrecy. Rose Henderson was married to the county sheriff, but the child wasn't her husband's. A scandal could destroy the sheriff's career and the whole family's life. Agnes MacDonald, the last representative of an old family, agreed to help out of sympathy for a woman in trouble. Her farm was the perfect place for a secret birth. Remote, abandoned by neighbors, with an experienced midwife. In another folder, I found letters. They were addressed to Agnes from someone signed R.H. and dated 1950 to 1960. In a letter from 1955, I read, "Dear Agnes, it's been 28 years since the day you helped me in the most difficult hours of my life. I still think about the girl every day. I hope Dr. Blake found her a good family, as he promised. Sometimes I dream of finding her, but I'm afraid to destroy her happy life with my appearance." A letter from 1962. "Dear Agnes, I finally divorced Thomas. He never learned the truth about that spring of 1927. Sometimes I think I should have found my daughter when I was free from marriage. But so many years have passed. What if she doesn't want to know me?" The last letter was from 1968. "Dear friend, I'm 69 years old, and my health is failing. If something happens to you before me, I ask you, leave information about that day in May somewhere. If my girl ever comes looking for me, let her find the way. I put a map to your farm in her music box. I hope someday she'll find it." The music box, the map, everything fit together. At the very bottom of the stack of letters lay an envelope marked "For Rose's daughter, if she comes." Inside was a photograph and a short note in Agnes MacDonald's handwriting. "Dear girl, if you're reading this, you found your way to the truth. Your mother, Rose, was the bravest woman I knew. She gave you away, not because she didn't love you, but because she loved you too much. She wanted a better life for you than she could give. Dr. Blake was your father, a good man who also sacrificed everything for your welfare. They both loved you." Agnes MacDonald, 1970. The photograph showed 3 people: a young woman with sad eyes, my mother, an elderly man in a white coat, Dr. Blake, and a gray-haired woman in an apron, Agnes. All were looking at something off camera with expressions of tenderness and longing. Probably at me, newborn. I sat in the abandoned house and cried. Finally, I had the whole truth. But was it too late to meet those who gave me life? The next day, I went to Marion County Archives to learn more about the Henderson and MacDonald families. The archive clerk confirmed that Thomas Henderson was sheriff from 1920 to 1938. He had a wife, Rose, and a son, Michael, born in 1921. Thomas died in 1970. When asked about Rose, the clerk answered sadly, "Mrs. Henderson lived a difficult life after her husband's death. She drank, ended up in a treatment facility, then in a nursing home called Sunny Hills. Died 4 years ago. My heart sank. My mother died when I was 44, and I didn't even know it. The clerk told me that Mrs. Collins from the nursing home often said strange things about Rose. She constantly talked about a lost daughter, about a music box and a map. Everyone thought these were senile fantasies. About the MacDonald family, the clerk knew little. Agnes was the last of the line, lived as a hermit on the farm, died in 1971, the year after Thomas Henderson, had no children, left the farm to the county. I drove to Sunny Hills. The director, Mrs. Collins, remembered Rose Henderson well. Rose was a very quiet and sad woman. She hardly talked to other residents, but sometimes told amazing stories about a daughter she gave away many years ago. She described the music box in detail: carved wood, mother of pearl, ballerina in a blue dress. Mrs. Collins had some of Rose's belongings, a diary and photographs. In the diary, I found entries that confirmed the whole story. Rose counted years by my real birth date, 1927. She remembered every birthday of mine, dreamed of meeting me, hoped I would find the music box. An entry from May 3rd, 1970, a year before her death. My girl is 43 today. I wonder if she found the secret in the music box. Agnes promised to leave information at the farm if something happened to me first. Maybe someday my daughter will come there and learn the truth. I so want to hug her at least once. The last entry was from January 1971. Health is very poor. I'm afraid I won't live to see meeting my daughter, but I believe she'll find the way to the truth. Dr. Blake promised me he would watch over her. He's a good man, a good father. Even if I don't see her, I know she's safe. Dr. Blake, my biological father. Was he still alive? On Monday, I began searching for Dr. Blake. The Oregon Medical Association told me that Dr. William Blake worked as a family physician in Bend from 1938 to 1975. Recently retired, but still alive. Lives in a nursing home called Pine Ridge. On Tuesday, I took time off and drove to Bend. Pine Ridge turned out to be a modern facility surrounded by pine trees. I waited in the lounge, holding the photograph from the farm and Agnes's documents. What would I tell this man? How could I explain who I was? At 2:00, an elderly man with a cane entered the lounge. Tall, thin, with a gray beard and intelligent blue eyes. Despite being 87 years old, he looked alert. I stood and showed him the photograph from MacDonald Farm. He looked at the picture and his face changed. He paled, sank into a chair. He recognized the photograph, asked in a trembling voice where I got it. I said my name was Jessica Williams, and I thought he was my father. Dr. Blake covered his face with his hands. For 48 years he had waited for and feared this meeting at the same time. I told him about the music box, the map, the discoveries at the farm, about how I learned the truth about my birth. Dr. Blake cried listening to my story. Then he began his own. He had been a family doctor, treating many families in the county, including the Hendersons. Thomas was a hard man, a good sheriff, but a bad husband. He cheated on Rose, sometimes raised his hand to her, drank. The doctor gradually fell in love with Rose, seeing her suffering, and she found support and understanding in him. Their affair was brief but sincere. When Rose became pregnant in winter, 1926, they both understood Admitting the truth was impossible. Divorce in those days was a scandal that would have destroyed both their careers. And if Thomas had found out about the affair, he could have killed them both. Dr. Blake organized the secret birth through Agnes MacDonald, who was an experienced midwife. He changed the birth date in documents so no one would connect the baby to events in the Henderson family. He personally chose the adoptive parents, the Williams family, who couldn't have children but were kind and loving people. After that, he moved to Bend, married a local teacher, started a family, but he never forgot his first daughter. He hired a private detective every few years to keep track of my life. He knew about my success in school, college admission, marriage, children. Sometimes he helped anonymously. The college scholarship, favorable home loan, free treatment for my son. All this was his care. He wanted to contact me after Rose's divorce from Thomas in 1940. But by then, Rose was psychologically broken. Years of living with a cruel husband, losing a child. Secrets had destroyed her health. The doctor realized it was better for the child to stay with the stable Williams family than return to a sick mother. He watched Rose from a distance, paid for her treatment anonymously. He knew about her death, but didn't dare appear at the funeral. Now he was 87, his health weak. He had 2 children from his second marriage, my half-brother and sister, who knew nothing of my existence. Dr. Blake took my hand in his trembling palms. He asked forgiveness for all the years of silence, said he thought about me every day, was proud of my achievements, rejoiced in my happiness. He was afraid his appearance would destroy my life, just as his love for Rose once destroyed her life. We sat together all day. He told me about Rose, what she was like before marriage to Thomas, intelligent, creative, dreamy. He showed me the only photograph he'd saved, Rose with a book in her hands, smiling and happy. He told me about the day I was born, how Rose held me for a few minutes before getting me away, how she cried and whispered that she loved me more than life. By evening, I knew my whole family's story. The tragic story of love that gave me life, but destroyed my parents' lives. The next day, Dr. Blake introduced me to his children, my half-brother and sister. Richard was 50, worked as an engineer. Susan was 47, taught school. They were shocked by the news of an older sister's existence, but welcomed me warmly. Especially Susan, who said she'd always felt someone was missing from the family. I learned I had nephews and nieces, a whole family I'd never suspected. But the most important discovery awaited me. Dr. Blake told me about Michael Henderson, Rose's son from her first marriage, my half-brother through our mother. Michael lived in Salem, was a retired police officer. His whole life, he'd wondered why his mother began acting so strangely after 1927, why she fell into depression and began drinking. He knew nothing about the secret birth, about my existence. To him, I was a daughter who was never born. On Saturday, I drove to Salem to meet Michael Henderson. The archive clerk gave me his address. Michael turned out to be a sturdy man, a 54 with kind eyes, very similar to our mother's eyes. He lived alone in a small house after his wife's recent death. When I told him the truth about the events of 1927, he didn't believe it at first. Then he got angry. How could they hide a sister's existence from him for so many years? But then, when emotions settled, he understood the logic of Mother's decision. In the 20s, a scandal would have destroyed not only his father's career, but his own future. The son of an adulterous sheriff couldn't have become a police officer. Michael showed me family photographs, told me about our mother. Rose was an artist before marriage, painted landscapes, dreamed of studying at art college. But Thomas forbade her to engage in nonsense. After 1927, she changed, became withdrawn, often cried for no reason, began drinking. Thomas thought these were women's whims, and Michael considered it the result of an unhappy marriage. Now he understood. Mother grieved for her lost daughter. Michael took me to the cemetery where Rose was buried, a simple grave with the inscription Rose Henderson, 1899 to 1971, loving mother. I stood at the grave of the woman who gave me life, and finally could say thank you to her. Thank you for choosing a better life for me than she could give herself. Thank you for the music box with a secret that led me to the truth 40 years later. Michael put his hand on my shoulder. He told me that in her last years, Mother often came to this cemetery, though Father was buried elsewhere. She would stand here whispering something, looking towards the children's section. Now he understood. She was talking to me, to the daughter she thought was lost forever. We agreed to meet with the children, his son and daughter, my nephews. Michael said he'd always dreamed of a big family, and now he had one. On the way back to Portland, I thought about the strange turns of fate. For 48 years, I lived without knowing the truth about my origins, and it took an old music box breaking to open a secret that 3 people had kept for half a century. Now I had the complete picture. Rose Henderson, my mother, was a victim of an unhappy marriage and social prejudices of her time. Dr. William Blake, my father, sacrificed the opportunity to know his daughter for her welfare. Agnes MacDonald, a kind woman who helped with the birth and kept the secret until her death. They all loved me in their own way. Rose, by giving me to better hands. Dr. Blake, by watching over me from afar and helping anonymously. Agnes, by leading information for future searches. And the Williams family gave me what my biological parents couldn't: stability, unconditional love, a normal childhood without secrets and scandals. A week later, I organized a family meeting. Dr. Blake came from Bend with his children, Richard and Susan. Michael brought his children from Salem. My children, Emily and James, were there too. We gathered in my house, and for the first time in 50 years, 2 branches of the family were reunited. The children listened to the family story in amazement. Some cried, learning about Grandmother Rose's tragic fate. Dr. Blake showed everyone Rose's letters, which he'd kept all his life. Letters in which she wrote about her dreams of finding her daughter, about how she imagined our meeting. Susan, my half-sister, said she now understood why Father was always so sad on May 3rd. It was the birthday of the daughter he couldn't acknowledge. Richard told how Father often traveled to Portland for medical conferences, but never took the family. Now it was clear he came to watch my life. Michael showed photographs of Mother from the family album. In earlier pictures, Rose looked happy, like a creative woman. In later ones, tired and sad. We talked until late at night, recovering lost years, getting to know each other, making plans for the future. Dr. Blake asked everyone's forgiveness for the years of silence. He explained he acted from the best intentions, trying to protect families from pain and scandals. I told him I held no anger. On the contrary, I was grateful for his care all these years. The anonymous help I considered luck. was actually the love of a father who couldn't openly participate in his daughter's life. We decided to meet regularly, introduce the children to each other, create a big, friendly family. A month later, Dr. Blake moved to a nursing home in Portland to be closer to me. His health was deteriorating, and he wanted to spend his remaining time near his daughter. I visited him every day. We talked about mother, about his youth, about medicine, about life. He told me family stories I'd never heard. Dr. Blake died 6 months after we met, peacefully in his sleep, holding my hand. His last words were, "Tell Rose I never forgot her." The whole newfound family gathered at the funeral. Richard and Susan said they were glad to have known me, even if it happened so late. Michael spoke about the importance of forgiveness and not holding grudges. After the funeral, I went to the cemetery to Mother's grave. I placed a bouquet of white roses, her favorite flowers, as Michael told me, by her headstone. I told her about meeting Father, about the family reunion, about her secret finally being revealed, about how I wasn't angry with her for deciding to give me away. Now I understood. It was an act of love, not rejection. Standing at her grave, I took out the repaired music box. Henry had returned it to me in perfect condition. The ballerina again spun to Brahms' lullaby. I opened the lid and gentle melody flowed over the quiet cemetery, the same melody that lulled me to sleep as a child. That was my only connection to a woman whose name I didn't know. Now I knew her name. Rose Henderson. Artist, dreamer, woman who sacrificed her happiness for my future. In the secret compartment of the music box now lay new treasures, photographs of our whole family, letters from half-brothers and sisters, notes from grandchildren. The music box had again become a repository of family love, but now this family was much larger. Today, 2 years after that memorable music box breakdown on my birthday, I live a completely different life. I have an extended family that gathers regularly for holidays. The children became friends with their newfound cousins. Michael became a real brother to me, with whom we share memories of Mother. I wrote a detailed family history for future generations, so the truth would never be lost again. Grandchildren will know about their roots, about the tragic love that gave them life, about the sacrifices their ancestors made. Every May 3rd, on my birthday, the whole family gathers together. We light candles, not only for my years of life, but in memory of Rose and Dr. Blake, whose love made this reunion possible. And each time I open the music box, listening to the melody that once was my only connection to the past, and now has become the soundtrack to a whole family's story. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if the music box hadn't broken that day. Maybe I would have lived my whole life not knowing the truth. Maybe Dr. Blake would have died without ever meeting me. Maybe Rose's secret would have gone to the grave with her. But fate decided otherwise. A secret kept for 40 years was revealed exactly when it was needed, when I was mature enough to understand and forgive, when I had time to get to know my father before his death, when the family was ready to accept the truth without judgment. The music box sits on my desk again, as it had all these years. But now it's not a symbol of loss, but of finding. Not a question without an answer, but a story with a happy ending. Every evening, falling asleep, I hear its quiet melody and think about the mother who 48 years ago chose a life full of love for me, about the father who cared for me from afar his whole life, about kind Agnes, who helped preserve both secret and truth. And I thank fate that sometimes the lost can be found, the broken can be fixed, and families can reunite even after half a century of separation. There was a map in the music box, and it truly led me to my mother, and to my father, and to a whole family whose existence I never suspected. Sometimes the simplest things hold the most complex stories, and the saddest secrets can have the brightest endings.